Welcome back to part 2 of this week's story, where we're going to discuss the Salem witch trials. If you haven't already listened to part 1 about the early trials in Europe and North America, I highly suggest you go back and listen to that before proceeding here. So follow the sound of my voice as we go back in time to February of 1692 and the town of Salem, Massachusetts. In February of 1692, reports had begun to surface about two young girls in the town of Salem named Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. These two girls were related to the town Reverend Samuel. They were experiencing what was originally described as fits that were beyond the power of epileptic fits, and now a lot of the behaviors that the girls were exhibiting were thought akin to what was described in Cotton Mather's book, some of which bear a striking similarity to the modern-day symptoms of demonic possession. These behaviors were confirmed by an account of Reverend Deodat Lawson, who was a former minister in Salem. For their part, the girls would make complaints of being pinched or pricked by what they would describe as pins. They were examined by a physician named William Griggs, who confirmed that the two girls were not suffering from any form of physical ailment. This would eventually begin to spread to other women in Salem. Reverend Lawson would even attempt to give sermons as a guest preacher in the town, but would be unable to get through from start to finish without the outcry of some of these afflicted women. This led to the first of 3 arrests and the start of the witch trials in Salem. The first women to be accused of witchcraft in Salem were Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and a slave girl named Tituba. Their charges were causing the strange afflictions to Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Hubbard. These accusations were levied when Paris and Williams were asked by Reverend Lawson who did this to them. Almost in unison, they shouted the names of the 3 women. Sarah Good came from a great upbringing, but unfortunately was dealt a bad hand later in life. Her father committed suicide when she was just 16 years old. He possessed a 70-acre estate worth about £500, but didn't leave a will. When the dust settled, Sarah was married off to an indentured servant named Daniel, who died soon thereafter and was given no parcel of land. From this, she came into heavy debt due to debts incurred by her husband that he left her with. Both she and her new husband were cast to the streets, forced to beg to survive. She developed a reputation for being unpleasant. Even her own husband would go so far as to describe her as an enemy to all good, and it was believed that he had a distaste for his wife's demeanor and had begun to detest her for not meeting his expectations. She was accused of witchcraft, largely tied to her rejecting the Puritan doctrine regarding self-control, leading children to damnation rather than salvation. When she was arrested and brought in for trial, her accusers began to rock back and forth in her presence. As the trial progressed, one of her accusers fell into a fit themselves, and when she calmed down, she claimed that Good had attacked her with a knife. Normally, this could be chalked up to heresy, but the accuser was able to produce a piece of the knife that had been recovered from the alleged assault. Fortunately for Sarah, This claim was able to be refuted by a young man who stood up and informed the tribunal that it had actually broken off from his knife the previous day. The accuser was able to get the piece of knife that was missing because she had witnessed the knife break. The young man was able to produce the remainder of the knife and prove his story. Even though she lied, the accuser was only scolded by Judge William Stoughton. When Sarah was afforded the opportunity to defend herself, she vehemently proclaimed her innocence. She would accuse Osborne and Tituba of being the real witches. But this would not be enough to sway the court. Sarah Good was convicted and sentenced to death. Her sentence was set to be carried out on the 29th of July, 1692. While imprisoned, Sarah Good was pregnant and gave birth in her cell. Unfortunately, the child would not survive and passed away soon after. Even up until it was her turn to hang, Sarah Good protested her absolute innocence. She was undoubtedly sure of this, so much so that Reverend Nicholas Noyes tried but was unsuccessful in eliciting a confession from her. As legend has it, she would yell at him, "I am no more of a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Sarah Good's last words might only be a story, as they don't appear in any of the reports surrounding her execution. Or this may have been a curse. 25 years later, Noyes would pass away, choking on his own blood. Sarah Good met death at the end of a rope alongside 4 other women later that day. Sarah Osborne was born in Massachusetts in the early 1600s and married a well-off man named Robert Prince, who was the brother-in-law of the well-known Putnam family in Salem. Together, the pair would have 2 sons and a daughter, Joseph, James, and Elizabeth. Sarah Osborne's husband passed away in 1674, but she would go on to marry an Irish immigrant named Alexander, who would eventually pay off his debt that was owed to Sarah, and he married her. Prince's last 2 wishes were that the land be passed to his 2 sons, a heavy 150-acre piece of land. Sarah would go against traditional social convention and keep the property for herself and her husband. This would cause a legal rift between her and her children. This would not echo well in the Salem high society, as the executor of the will, John Putnam, was named as Prince's executor. In addition to her legal battle, Osborne was unable to attend church for a period of almost 3 years, locked in a battle with an illness. It could possibly have been believed that due to her social standing and legal battle in which John Putnam was involved, that her accusations coming were more suggestions, owing to the power that the Putnam family held in Salem. Sarah Osborne was arrested on the 1st of March and placed in jail. 6 days later, she was sent to Boston with Good and Tituba. Osborne proclaimed that she too was innocent and denied any and all forms of involvement with evil spirits. Much like Sarah Good, she too did not offer a confession, but, unlike her, did not accuse the other 2. Sarah Osborne would not see the gallows, however, as she passed away while imprisoned on the 29th of May at the age of 49. The third woman, Tituba, was actually the first who was accused. It is believed she was from Barbados and married an indigenous man who was claimed to have been of Colombian heritage. Another theory is that she may have been indigenous herself, of the Arawak-Guyana tribe in Southern America. Historians believe that she was originally of South America and forced into slavery in Barbados. There, she was sold to the Thompson plantation and worked as the family cook. It was here that many believed she picked up what she knew about witchcraft from some of the other slaves. When the owner of the plantation died, she was inherited, this sounds awful to say, by Samuel Parris and brought to Massachusetts. It was widely believed that she may have been the one to mention stories of voodoo and witchcraft to Parris and Williams, leading to her accusation, and that it was believed she told them stories of the occult from the Malleus Maleficarum. Going to trial, she was handcuffed by social convention. She was unable to speak out against her accusers because of her race. It was illegal for slaves to give any form of testimony during court proceedings. Tituba, unlike the others, was the first to profess her guilt, claiming to have spoken with the devil. He would order her to worship him and do harm to the children of the village. Tituba was convicted of her accused crimes and sent to Boston with Good and Osborne. She was not executed like Sarah Good, but was forced to spend 13 months in prison as her master wouldn't pay her jail fees. In April of 1963, she was sold to an unknown person for the price of those fees and disappeared. It was later discovered that her confession was only given as Samuel Parris had beat her so severely, and then made sure that she knew what to say when she was questioned. This would only be the start of the witch trials in Salem. In March of 1692, the next round of accusations and arrests took place. Those accused were Martha Corey, Dorothy Good, who was normally referred to as Dorcas, and only 4 years old when she was accused, Rebecca Nurse, and Rachel Clinton. Many of the girls named were from the town of Salem. However, Clinton was from the neighboring town of Ipswich. Corey was arrested for expressing skepticism and the lack of credibility for the accusations brought against Good, Osborne, and Tituba, which would cause her to draw a great amount of attention. It came as a shock that Corey and Nurse were accused, largely because they were so heavily involved in the church in Salem. The townspeople were taken aback by this. It was believed that if these two upstanding people could be witches, then anyone could be. Unfortunately, their devoutness would not be a shield for them against the accusations. For Martha Corey, she didn't even believe that witches or wizards truly existed. She was a staunch skeptic of the trials as a whole. Because of this, she began to speak out publicly against them, causing her to be accused by two young girls named Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis. When she had her day in court, Corey was entirely truthful and had never doubted any other verdict than exoneration. The accusers testified against her. Martha would tell the court not to believe the ramblings of two hysterical children. The girls ended up working together, weaving a story about Martha and why they accused her. They would begin to mimic her movements, making it appear as though Corey was controlling them. Mercy Lewis would even shout that a man was whispering in her ear that she said was Satan. Because of this charade, Martha Corey was found guilty and convicted of witchcraft. She was hanged on the 22nd of September, 1692, at the age of 72. Her death marked a serious beginning of a turning point for the worse in the history of the Salem witch trials. Because she was an outstanding member of society, the walls and social boundaries were broken down and anyone could be accused of being a witch. It would lead to over 100 women being accused of the crime. Unfortunately, this would not be the end for their family. Martha's husband Giles defended her in the trial against these allegations. Because of his defense, this would eventually lead him to being tried of the same crimes. Giles did not defend himself in the trial, believing that if he pled guilty, then his heirs would lose his estate and inheritance. He was convicted and sentenced to death by pressing, the practice of crushing a human under the weight of stones. When the jurors tried to get a confession from him, he would only ask for more weight. Giles's execution took place on the 19th of September, 1692, only 3 days before his wife was hung. Their estate would end up being passed on to their children, who always professed that their parents were innocent. As mentioned before, Dorothy Good was only 4 years old at the time of the Salem witch trials. Nonetheless, this would not exempt her from being interrogated. She would confess to being a witch and having witnessed her mother, Sarah, practicing witchcraft. Her accusers, Mary Walcott and Ann Putnam Jr., would state that she was deranged, having bitten them repeatedly as though she were some kind of animal. She was placed in jail and visited by officials only 2 days later. She would state that she had a snake and spoke to her and sucked blood from her finger. The snake was believed to be a familiar, which is a form of spiritual servant. Dorothy remained in custody from the day of her arrest on the 24th of March until the 10th of December, when she was released for the sum of £50, never having been indicted or tried. Rebecca Nurse was known around Salem for her extreme piety and bore the reputation of being one of the most unlikely persons to have been accused of witchcraft. This would not save her from the accusations of Edward and John Putnam, and she was arrested on the 23rd of March, 1692. When she read the accusations, the 71-year-old stated, "I am innocent, as the child unborn, but surely what sin hath God found in me unrepented of, that he should lay such an affliction on me in my old age?" Much like Martha Corey, there was a public outcry for Rebecca Nurse. Her reputation for benevolence and amity echoed through the community of Salem. One of her accusers, Sarah Holton, would even change her stance and recount the accusation. 39 prominent members of the community signed a petition on her behalf. Even the magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, who would regard guilt as self-evident, had to take a different approach with Rebecca. They told her that if she was truly innocent, then they prayed God would show her innocence. Even Hawthorne's sister, Elizabeth Porter, was one of Nurse's strongest defenders. The trial began on the 30th of June with Nurse representing herself, and she was not afforded the opportunity to have a lawyer. She was defended by many of the town members who had signed the petition, and in the end, the jury rendered a verdict of not guilty. The jury then asked for a second chance of deliberation, which was a common legal practice of the time. They would ask Rebecca to explain a remark that another witch on accusations, Deliverance Hobbs, was in company with her. This would imply that they both signed a pact with the devil. Nurse stated that they were not friends, but she was merely referring to the fact that they were both accused of the same thing. The jury would not see this the way that she meant and overturned their verdict. This would sentence her to death on the 19th of July. She was originally granted a reprieve after a letter from the governor William Phipps was sent, but the stay was later rescinded. She was hung and buried in a shallow grave. The last of the March accusations was Rachel Clinton, who was already having a rough go at life after being the victim of an extramarital affair on her husband's part. She was forced to beg for money to sustain herself, and because of this, her accusations began to appear. Many residents of Ipswich were called to testify against her and would say such things as she had caused the death of a neighbor simply by passing her by. Another stated that Rachel would pick at women of quality and worth. It was even believed, and was testified to it, that Rachel would even shapeshift into such things as dogs and, of all things, turtles. Another witness, William Baker, would make the claim that he lost a good amount of beer to Rachel through supernatural means. Through Rachel Clinton's accusers and those who testified against her, you can see just how loose accusations could be just to get a person convicted. In the end, Rachel Clinton was not convicted, and she died on the 7th of January, 1695, after living a destitute existence. Circling back around, one of the things that always took place before any of these trials were physical examinations. Doctors would look for unique things like moles and birthmarks, as these were commonly believed to be indicative of the devil's influence. Birthmarks were even believed to be associated with the devil having drank the blood of the accused. April would bring again another round of accusations and arrests, some of which were related to those who were previously accused. This would start a period of mass accusations and executions. Among the first to be arrested were Sarah Cloyce, the sister of Rebecca Nurse, and Elizabeth Proctor. The women were examined in Salem by the magistrates Hawthorne and Corwin, among other prominent members of the town, state, and other medical practitioners. Proctor's husband, John, was infuriated by the examinations, and he too would be arrested the same day as his wife. Over the course of the next few weeks, more arrests took place. Giles Corey, Martha's husband mentioned previously, Abigail Hobbs, Bridget Bishop, Mary Warren, and Deliverance Hobbs. The Hobbs women and Warren would confess to their crimes and begin to name others: Sarah Wilds, William Hobbs, Nehemiah Abbott, Mary Town Esty, who was the sister of Cloyce and Nurse, Edward Bishop Jr., his wife Sarah, and Mary English. The end of April would see the arrests of Reverend George Burroughs, Lydia Dustin, Susanna Martin, Dorcas Hoare, Sarah Morey, and Philip English. Nehemiah Abbott was released as it was confirmed that he was not the specter that he was accused of being. Mary Esty was originally released because there was not enough evidence brought against her, however was arrested for a second time when her accusers levied new allegations. As time rolled into May, accusations and arrests would continue. However, some of those accused began to grow wise and were able to evade their arrest warrants. Warrants were issued for George Jacobs, Daniel Andrews, John Willard, and Elizabeth Colson, who were not caught. Up to this point, the proceedings were purely investigative, but this took on a much darker turn. On the 27th of May, 1692, William Phipps would order the creation of a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which would service the counties of Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex, which would prosecute those who were being held on the charges of witchcraft. With its creation, another 36 arrest warrants would be issued, with some notable names being Sarah Dustin, John Willard, Alice Parker, Anne Puditer, Roger Toothaker, Martha Carrier, Wilmot Reed, Elizabeth Howe, and John Alden. On the 31st of May, Cotton Mather would get involved. He wrote a letter to one of the court's judges, John Richards, displaying his outright support for the prosecutions. But he would caution Richards in the following manner: "Do not lay more stress on pure spectral evidence than it will bear. It is very certain that the devils have sometimes represented the shapes of not only the innocent, but also the very virtuous. Though I believe that the just God then ordinarily provides a way for the speedy vindication of the persons thus abused." The Court of Oyer and Terminer would officially convene in Salem on the 2nd of June. Serving on the tribunal were William Stoughton, the Lieutenant Governor who served as Chief Magistrate, Thomas Newton, the Crown's prosecuting attorney, and Stephen Sewell, the court clerk. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop. Her crime was not living a Puritan lifestyle. She wore black clothing and strange costumes. She was also described as living an immoral lifestyle, which would seal her fate, and the jury would find her guilty of witchcraft on only the first day of her trial. Only 8 days later, on the 10th of June, she was executed. On the 3rd, John Willard and Rebecca Nurse were indicted, but didn't stand trial right away for reasons that have been lost to history. Following the execution of Bishop, the court would adjourn for a period of 20 days. They sought advice from influential ministers in New England to garner their opinion on where things stood. The responses were compiled by Cotton Mather into 8 paragraphs, which read as the following. 1. The afflicted state of our poor neighbors that are now suffering by molestations from the invisible world, we apprehend so deplorable that we think their condition calls for the utmost help of all persons in several capacities. 2. We cannot, but with all thankfulness, acknowledge the success which the merciful God has given unto the sedulous and assiduous endeavors of our honorable rulers to detect the abominable witchcrafts which have been committed in the country, humbly praying that the discovery of those mysterious and mischievous wickednesses may be perfected. 3. We judge that, in the prosecution of these and all such witchcrafts, that there is a need and a very critical and exquisite caution, lest by too much credulity, for these things received only upon the devil's authority, there be a door opened for a long train of miserable consequences, and Satan get an advantage over us, for we should not be ignorant of his devices. 4. As in complaints upon witchcrafts, there must be matters of inquiry which do not amount to matters of presumption, and there must be matters of presumption which yet may not be matters of conviction. So it is necessary that all proceedings thereabout be managed with an exceeding tenderness towards those that may be complained of, especially if they be persons formerly of an unblemished reputation. 5. When the first inquiry is made into the circumstances of such as may lie under the just suspicion of witchcrafts, we could wish that there may be admitted as little as is possible of such noise, company, and openness as may too hastily expose them that are examined, and that there may no thing be used as a test for the trial of the suspected, the lawfulness whereof may be doubted among the people of God, but that the directions given by such judicious writers as Perkins and Bernard be consulted in such a case. 6. Presumptions whereupon persons may be committed, and much more, convictions whereupon persons may be condemned as guilty of witchcrafts, ought certainly to be more considerable than barely the accused persons being represented by a spectre unto the afflicted, inasmuch as undoubted and notorious things, that a demon may, by God's permission, appear, even to ill purposes, in the shape of the innocent and a virtuous man. Nor can we esteem alterations made in the sufferers by a look of touch of the accused to be an infallible evidence of guilt, but frequently liable to be accused by the devil's legerdemains. 7. We do not know whether some remarkable affronts given by devils in our disbelieving those testimonies whose whole force and strength is from them alone may not put a period into the progress of the dreadful calamity begun upon us. In the accusations of so many persons, whereof some, we hope, are yet clear from the great transgression led into their charge. 8. Nevertheless, we cannot but humbly recommend unto the government the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious according to the direction given in the laws of God and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the direction and detection of witchcrafts. As was noted by historian Thomas Hutchinson, the power that the first and last paragraphs held completely dismissed all other arguments therein. This renewed the resolve of the courts to ensure that the cases were dealt with speedily and vigorously. This would cause one member, Major Nathaniel Saltonstall, to resign from the court on the 16th of June due to his dissatisfaction with Mather's letter, and the fact that the existence of spectral evidence was not barred from admission in court. He was later lauded for being the only man of his time who had the sense to condemn the trials. Throughout late June and into early July, further indictments were brought against many who were being held. Good, Howe, Martin, the Proctors, Carrier, Wilds, and Hoare. The next to stand trial were Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse, all of whom were found guilty and executed by hanging on the 19th of July. August would bring indictments against Burroughs, Estey, Corey, and George Jacobs. Guilty convictions were made against Martha Carrier, George Jacobs, George Burroughs, John Willard, and the Proctors, Elizabeth and John. As Elizabeth Proctor was pregnant, she was granted a temporary stay of execution, but the remainder were executed on the 19th of August, 1692. The executions from the 19th of August were remembered by a merchant named Robert Califf as the following. Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with the others through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocence, with such solemn and serious expressions as were to the administration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, as witches were not supposed to be able to recite, was so well worded and uttered with such composedness and such fervency of spirit, as was very affecting and drew tears from many, so that, if seemed to some of the spectators, would not hinder the execution. The accusers said the black man stood and dictated to him, as soon as he was turned off and hanged, Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, addressed himself to the people, partly to declare that Mr. Burroughs was no ordained minister, partly to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light. And this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. When Mr. Burroughs was cut down, he was dragged by a halter to a hole or grave between the rocks. It was about 2 feet deep, his shirt and breeches being pulled off, and an old pair of trousers of one executed put on his lower parts. He was so put in, together with Willard and Carrier, that one of his hands and his chin and a foot of one of them was left uncovered. In September, another 18 indictments were issued. 4 of those who were tried would plead guilty, and another 11 would be found guilty during their trials. On the 22nd of September, 8 more people were executed. Mary Estey, Martha Corey, Ann Puditer, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Reed, and Margaret Scott. Martha Corey was the last victim to be executed in the Salem witch trials. Dorcas Hoare would be given a temporary reprieve after overwhelming support from the ministerial community. Mary Bradbury, who was 77 at this time, was able to escape confinement through help of her family and friends. Abigail Faulkner, another woman who was pregnant and granted a temporary reprieve from her execution, bought her enough time for an entire stay to be granted. October brought a major shift in the trials, for Governor William Phips returned from fighting in King William's War in Maine and was absolutely abhorred at what was happening. I hereby declare that as soon as I came from fighting and understood what danger some of their innocent subjects may be exposed to, if the evidence of afflicted persons only did prevail, either to the committing or trying of any of them, I did, before any application was made unto me, put a stop to the proceedings of the court, and they are now stopped until their majesties' pleasure be known. On the 29th of October, the court of Oyer and Terminer was disbanded by order of Governor Phips. With this order, there would be no more executions in the trials. Some believe the governor may have stepped in due to the accusations placed against his own wife, Mary. This would cause a break in any more prosecutions until the new year. In January of 1693, the Superior Court of Judicature, which was new, the Court of Assize, and General Jail Delivery would convene in Salem. Again, William Stoughton was appointed as the Chief Justice, while Anthony Checkley would continue as Crown Prosecutor, and Jonathan Ellison serving as the Clerk of the Court. The first 5 persons to be tried in this round were Sarah Buckley, Margaret Jacobs, Rebecca Jacobs, Mary Whitridge, and Job Tookey. Each of these 5 trials rendered a verdict of not guilty. Of those remaining in prison awaiting trial, only 16 were indicted and tried, with only 3 being found guilty. Those were Elizabeth Johnson, Sarah Wardwell, and Mary Post. Stoughton would create warrants for the executions of the 3 guilty verdicts, but all 3 were pardoned by Governor Phips, who would spare their lives. The court would convene in Charlestown in early February, trying another 5: Sarah Cole, Lydia Dustin, Sarah Dustin, Mary Taylor, and Mary Toothaker. All of these women were found not guilty and were released from prison once their jail fees were paid. The court would then convene in Boston around mid-April. Here, the name of John Alden was cleared. In May, during their trials in Ipswich, they would dismiss charges against all but 5: Mary Bridges, Mary Barker, William Barker, Susanna Post, and Eunice Fry, but eventually all were found not guilty. The court hearings in Ipswich would mark the end of the witch trials in Massachusetts. This would not end the legacy that the trials would leave. Many survivors and family members have sought and fought to recognize the innocence of those who were convicted and executed. They fought for monetary compensation, and that would continue for centuries even after the trials. Events were held in Salem in 1992 to commemorate the trials. In November of 2001, at the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the trials, the Massachusetts legislature would pass an act which exonerated all who were convicted, naming each as innocent. The only exception was Elizabeth Johnson. Johnson was later exonerated by the Massachusetts Senate on the 26th of May this year, 2022. Elizabeth Johnson's name was omitted from the list of those exonerated and was petitioned by Carrie LaPierre and her 8th grade students at North Andover Middle School. The Salem witch trials have made a lasting impression on society, to the point that even those who don't know the exact history of the trials are familiar with the name and how synonymous the town of Salem is with witchcraft and executions. They are a key focal point for the application of justice in the trial of things unseen. To this day, humanity struggles with the concepts of the occult and its influence on society, much like the case of the trial of Arne Johnson. One thing that really stands out as detestable in the entirety of this historical event is how ridiculous the claims of witchcraft and those accusations seem. Although we can't truly judge the actions of those from centuries ago by the standards and knowledge today, To sum up, the shift from radical to realistic can be seen in the quote from Increase Mather. "It would be better that 10 suspected witches escape than one innocent person be condemned." To close this episode, in their memory, I'll read each of the names of those victims who perished, either in prison awaiting trial or execution at Gallows Hill in Salem because of their supposed crimes. Let us learn from their deaths and never repeat them again. Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, George Burroughs, George Jacobs Sr., Martha Carrier, John Proctor, John Willard, Mary Esty, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Ann Puditor, Wilmot Reed, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, Giles Corey, Martha Corey, Ann Foster, Sarah Osborne. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our 2-part episode on the history of witch trials and Salem. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast, please visit our link tree in the show notes. Before you go, remember to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any of the weekly exciting stories to come. And make sure you check back this Thursday for another special bonus episode just for spooky season 2022, titled The Harbinger of the Hohenzollerns. I'll be back again next Tuesday for our regular episode, as we travel to meet the Perrin family at their farm on Round Top Road and explore the terrifying true story that inspired The Conjuring. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of The Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week.